term, we are going to be going over the muscular system, and then we're going to talk about Francie, I have your stuff here, the muscular system, but then we're going to also talk about the endocrine system, and then we're going to talk about the special senses, which include things like sight, vision, and hearing in particular, because those actually relate directly, obviously, to the nervous system. Okay, so are there any questions before we get started today? Okay, so when we're talking about the muscle tissue, we can talk about the characteristics of muscle tissue. So there are some important characteristics. And the first thing that's really important is that we can excite the skeletal muscle using the nervous system. So we have excitability. So we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about motor neurons synapsing with muscles and releasing neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. And that excitability actually has to do with a change in the membrane potential. And so remember that that is the difference between the inside charge and the outside charge. So when we talk about muscle tissue, we can also talk about depolarization. So remember, we talked about how neurons become depolarized and generate an action potential. Well, when skeletal muscles become depolarized, they actually cause contraction. So depolarization causes contraction. And so that gives us the next characteristic is that we have contractibility. So we now know that muscles do not push to do their work. They actually pull. So for example, muscles contract and pull on bones. They pull on bones when we're talking about skeletal muscle, for example, and this is what causes the movement. We know that muscles do not push, and so in order for me to like push my forearm away and extend it, then what that means is that there has to be muscles that do that work on the other side. So we have what are referred to as antagonistic muscles. So my biceps pull my forearm here, but when my triceps contract, they actually pull my arm straight, right? So muscles do not push. So I'll just put that in. So we have pairs of muscles that do opposite contractions. Now, this leads to the other idea is that we also have to have extensibility. So I just talked about extending my forearm. And in order for me to extend my forearm, my biceps muscle actually has to stretch, right? So the muscles can stretch. And part of that has to do with the muscle tissue. Part of it also has to do with the tendons and the ligaments also have some ability to extend or to stretch. But when we stretch our muscles, we'll talk about how you can have an optimal muscle length for producing the most contraction, the most force in terms of contraction. And then we also have elasticity. And what this means is that muscles tend to, when they are stretched, they tend to bounce back. So when we talk about elastic tissue, like in your ears. So your outer ear, when you bend your outer ear, it does not stay bent. When you stretch your muscle, it tends to not stay stretched all the way, but it comes back to its optimal length, right? And so this means that it has the ability to return to a proper length after it has been stretched. And interestingly, we actually have these proteins that are like springs. And so when you stretch them, the spring moves out, and then when they're not stretched, they come back together. So there's actually elasticity built in to the proteins that are in our muscles. Okay. So those are the characteristics. We can also talk about the function. So obviously, one obvious function is for movement, right? And these are the muscles that attach to bones. And so this could be like skeletal muscle. We'll talk about the different types of muscles. But movement also occurs in, say, for example, the contraction of the bladder. So this also moves fluid in the body, or the contraction of the stomach, or the contraction of the blood vessels. So we have movement like in terms of bones, right? But we also have fluids, right? That, for example, when we talk about smooth muscle, the contraction of the digestive tract actually moves the food, which is gastric juice and food mixed together through the digestive system. So that is another function of it. We can also talk about that we have to use the muscles to maintain posture. So even when you're standing up, you have muscles that are alternating contraction and relaxation right close to the spine that are allowing you to stay up in an upright position. And so babies develop posture, and it is actually, if you've ever been around a baby and they're like sitting up, they usually sit up pretty straight. And that's because they have reflexes, those spinal reflexes that we talked about, where the muscles are alternatingly relaxing and contracting. And then we start to learn to do this, and our reflexes don't work right. And so then we contract all of this, and it makes it much harder to breathe. And then people can become permanently, their bones can actually, older people can become permanently like this, right? And that can be bad for your overall health, okay? So maintaining posture is another function of muscles. The third function would be, for example, in temperature regulation. So can anybody give me an example of how your muscles would help in temperature regulation? Yes, so shivering, right? So shivering is where the muscles contract, and when they convert chemical energy to mechanical energy, it produces a lot of heat, right? And so you can actually use a lot of energy by shivering. And that is just another function of the skeletal muscles in particular. We also have we have stabilizing joints. Now we talk about joints in 231. We'll talk a little bit more about movement because we're going to have to review the movement like abduction and abduction and flexion and extension when we start talking about the functions of the muscles. But some of the muscles are stabilizers. And so we have muscles that come around from the scapula and actually wrap around the shoulder joints. And so those are what are referred to as what? Does anybody remember? What are those four muscles that help to stabilize your shoulder joints? You're like, somebody says, oh, I've torn my rotator cuff. So as long as those muscles have good tone, which means they're in a partial state of contraction, they can help to stabilize that. Now, if you dislocate your shoulder, and that means that the humerus comes out of joint, then you can stretch those muscles, you could tear those muscles, you could tear the tendons that connect the muscles to the bone, and then your shoulder is less stable. Once you get rid of those muscles, then your shoulder is much more likely to come out of joint and become dislocated. Okay. And then we have some of the muscles enclose and protect the organs. And a good example of this would be the abdominal muscles. So what's it called when a part of your intestine protrudes out through the abdominal muscle? A hernia, right? And so sometimes if you strain, you can actually damage that. Sometimes when females are pregnant, they can separate the connective tissue that covers the rectus abdominis, the middle, and then it makes their abdominal muscles much weaker, right? And so the abdominal muscles, the rectus abdominis, and your oblique muscles are all very protective of all the organs that are in your abdominal cavity. So those are 5 functions. And so these would be good essay questions for the quiz that is not this Wednesday, but it would be next Monday. So it's a week from today. Okay, so we also have types of muscle. And so the types of muscle are listed in the table. This is actually at the end of chapter 9. And the first type of muscle is the skeletal muscle. It is striated. And we're going to talk about what those striations mean. But if you look really carefully, and I wish I would have blown this up, but there's actually striations on this muscle. And then the other interesting thing is that they are multinucleated. And this is because during embryonic development, the stem cells that are going to become muscle cells fuse. And what this means is that they can be long cells. Right? Not as long as the axons that extend all the way from your spinal cord down to the toes of your foot, but they could be long like in the quad muscles or the hamstring muscles. Those can be very long muscle cells. They are also said to be voluntary. And so remember that this is the somatic division of the PNS. PNS stands for peripheral nervous system, okay? So somatic division, so this is voluntary. So we talked about the primary motor cortex, which you send an action potential down through those pyramidal cells, down through the spinal cord, and then out through the ventral root, and then to the muscles. Does anybody remember what the neurotransmitter that is used to stimulate skeletal muscles is? Acetylcholine. So it would be acetylcholine. Okay, so we're going to spend most of our time talking about skeletal muscle, but we also have specialized cardiac muscle. Question?
No, I just said I know.
Oh, you know this, okay. Okay. So cardiac muscle is found where? Heart. The cells are shorter, and they might have 2 nuclei, but they generally have just 1 or 2 nuclei. So we'll put 1 to 2 nuclei. Cells are shorter, and they are branched. So if you think about the cardiac muscle cells, they have to contract against a fluid-filled space, which is the heart, filled with blood. And so they're not being able to attach to a skeletal element. So instead, they have between the cells what are called intercalated discs. And these are proteins that allow the cells to contract and they pull. So one cell will pull on another cell. And so up here you can see they're branched, and it's kind of difficult to see in this diagram, but the intercalated discs look like this, right? So they're between the two cells. Now, one of the interesting things about the cardiac muscle is that it has some cells that are self-excitable, right? So some cells, like in the pacemaker, right, can produce their own depolarization. Right? So it's interesting that in some organisms you can take the heart out, and I think I mentioned this in 231, but you can maybe you can watch the video about it. If you look at turtle hearts, Google that, and beating, you can see that when you take a heart out of a turtle, it will continue to beat all on its own, not connected to the nervous system, right? Our heart generally stops beating, but it still can survive. So we can talk about being able to transplant hearts from one individual into another after periods of hours of the heart being removed from the body. Okay? So this would also tend to be involuntary. We would say it's involuntary because I do not have to consciously focus on contracting those muscles and causing my heart. However, there are ways to do biofeedback. So for example, if you're on a heart monitor, you could probably slow your breath down, relax your mind, and you could probably slow your heart rate down when it's necessary, right? And likewise, you could think excitable thoughts, and it tends to increase the adrenaline in your body, and that would speed up the heart. Okay, so the last one is smooth muscle. So I'll put this one up here. So the smooth muscle is not striated. So I forgot to put cardiac muscle is striated. So I'll put striated. It is not striated, but it still has all the same proteins. It's just that they are arranged differently. So you do not see them staining like you do under a microscope like the other ones. So they're not striated. They're small cells. And they generally are in sheets. So they're together in sheets of tissue. So if you were to look at the digestive system or even the blood vessels, you would see that there are circular muscles. So those would like wrap around the stomach or the intestine. And if they contracted, then it would cause the diameter of that thing to decrease. So the circular muscles could contract and cause the diameter of the blood vessel to decrease. And then we have what are referred to as longitudinal muscles. So this actually causes a shortening, and this causes the diameter to increase. So I'll put this decreases diameter of whatever, of maybe the blood vessels or the stomach or the intestines or the esophagus, and this would increase the diameter by shortening. So that's just the space. And those actually work together to cause what is referred to as peristalsis, which is this alternation of relaxation and contraction, which helps to move the food through the digestive tract. And it occurs all the time. And if your digestive system stops contracting, the doctors will get really worried. And one thing that they know that will stimulate that is to get up and move. So they're like, oh, you have to walk the hallways. And you're like, why? I just had abdominal surgery, right? I don't want to walk. And one of the reasons why they do that is that helps to get that wave of contraction reestablished in your digestive system. So it's important for that to be maintained to keep things moving through. Okay, so those are the 3 different types of cells. These are also, these have only 1 nucleus. Okay, so when we look at skeletal muscle, we're going to focus on skeletal muscle next. One of the things that you'll note is that each muscle has different types of tissue. So a muscle is actually an organ. So this is an example of showing, what does this bone look like? Does anybody want to take a guess? That's a femur bone, right? And so that could be one of the big muscles that comes off of the femur. So that could be, for example, like a quadricep muscle or gracilis, the internal thigh muscles that come off the bone. Okay, so muscles are organs. And they're composed of more than one type of tissue. So nerves were also considered to be organs. So the sciatic nerve is actually an organ. So when we look at the names of the different levels of organization, we can talk about a muscle fiber. Now, we talked about cholinergic fibers and adrenergic fibers, and in the terms of the nervous system, a fiber was what? What's a cholinergic fiber? An axon, right? So a muscle fiber is actually a muscle cell. So here they show individual muscle fibers, right? So this would be the muscle fiber. And then you'll notice that one of the interesting things about that muscle fiber is that the nucleus, which is purple, is pushed to the outside. And so the muscle cell actually contains proteins that fill up most of the inside of the cell. And that is one way to kind of visualize this. And then you notice that a bundle of muscle fibers are connected, and that is referred to as a muscle fascicle. So this is a bundle of muscle fibers. It is wrapped by a connective tissue sheath, which is called the perimysium. So wrapped with the peri, which means around, and then mysium, which refers to the fact that it's muscle. So that's a connective tissue sheath. And then when we look at the muscle itself, the whole muscle, it is wrapped with the epimysium. So peri means around, epi means upon. So maybe the outer connective tissue covering. And this contains many fascicles. And it connects to the bone via a tendon. Most muscles connect via a tendon. Some of them connect via a connective tissue layer sheath, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. So a tendon is connective tissue. And remember that the bone itself has a connective tissue on the outside. So when you think about a bone, you think about it hard, and you're like, well, how can it connect to that? But the outside of the bone has a layer of connective tissue too. And that was called the periosteum. And so the tendon actually connects to the periosteum and pulls or can pull on the bone to cause movement at the joint. Okay. So when we look at the microscopic anatomy of the cell, we can talk about the muscle fibers. And we can talk about some of the organelles that are inside the muscle fibers. So for example, mitochondria. So you learned about mitochondria in cell biology, and you know that mitochondria are responsible for aerobic respiration and the production of ATP. We also have a organelle called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is like the endoplasmic reticulum in other cells, but it's only found in muscle cells. So sarco means flesh. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is an organelle that is only found in muscle cells. And it has a very important function in that it stores calcium ions. So calcium actually is an anion that has two plus charges to it. So it's missing 2 electrons. But it is important in muscle contraction. So it is important in initiating, the calcium is, muscle contraction. So the calcium can actually be released into the inside of the cell, and then it can be taken back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and stored. So it goes in, the calcium, it goes in and out, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay. Now, the muscle fiber itself has a plasma membrane, which is called the sarcolemma. So this is the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber. And the sarcolemma has ACH receptors. So acetylcholine receptors. And it has sodium ion channels. So when acetylcholine binds to the receptor, it causes the sodium ion channels to open, and it causes depolarization to occur. And then that depolarization can actually cause the release of the calcium ions. Okay. So if we look at a diagram of a muscle fiber, you need to be able to identify the different parts of it. Okay. So this is my sarcolemma, is just pointing to the outer plasma membrane. And you're like, well, how come there's multiple nuclei, right? But skeletal muscle is that way because of the way that it is produced during development. You'll also see that there are, so this would be my nuclei. You'll also see that there are many mitochondria, and it depends upon whether or not we're talking about an oxidative or glycolytic or fast versus slow muscle fiber twitch. We'll talk about those when we talk about the different types of muscle fibers, but those mitochondria are really important. And then finally, what makes up most of the cell, so you'd write this under your muscle fiber, is what is referred to as the myofibril. So this takes up about 80% of the cell space. And it is the reason why it is striated, because the myofibril is an organelle that contains myofilaments. Filaments. I didn't spell that right. Ments. There's an E in there. There we go. Myofilaments. Myofilaments are protein, right? So these are protein. And this is why skeletal muscle is so high in protein, is that the myofilaments make up the most, they fill the mass. And in fact, when you build muscle, one of the things that happens is the diameter of the muscle fiber increases. And so your muscles get bigger. And when the muscles get bigger, they actually have more protein in them, right? So this is why skeletal muscle is such a useful source of protein. So these myofilaments consist of actin and myosin. So I'm going to write down here, actin is the thin myofilament. I'll explain what this means in a second. And then myosin is what is referred to as the thick myofilament. So myo means muscle, so does sarco. Okay. So when we talk about these myofilaments, they are arranged in what are called sarcomeres. I know there's a lot of terminology here. Arranged in sarcomeres. So these are actually the fundamental unit of contraction. So sarcomeres can shorten or they can lengthen. Now, when people were first studying this, they thought, oh, well, these muscle myofilaments, they must have the ability. So think about like a rope. They must, if this is like a rope, then the proteins must have the ability to shorten themselves, and the proteins must have the ability to lengthen themselves, because that seemed like a reasonable explanation for how muscles could shorten or lengthen. But that was proved to be incorrect. And so the people that discovered it in like the 1960s got a Nobel Prize for this model, which is called the sliding filament model. Of muscle contraction. So the idea is that the proteins themselves do not shorten, but the way that the actin and myosin are arranged is that they overlap like this. And when the sarcomere, which would be like my hands together, they can slide together and the muscle will shorten, or they can be pulled apart and the muscle will lengthen. And so that is what is called the sliding filament. And it refers to the arrangement of the actin and the myosin. And in one unit, the sarcomere will shorten, but there's many, many sarcomeres down the length of a myofibril. Okay. So if we look at a diagram showing this idea, okay. So I'm not going to make you memorize the different zones and the different discs and the different bands. So some classes, I had to learn them all, but I don't think it's really that important. Okay, so I was like, I hated this part. So I'm like, I'm not going to make my students. If I ever teach this, I'm not going to make my students. Okay. So the whole idea here is this is part of a myofibril. Notice that these are thin. They're blue, but these are the thin ones. These are the thick ones. So this is the actin and this is the myosin, right? And notice how the way that they overlap create different lines and different zones. But the general idea here is that they will slide together and the sarcomere will shorten, or they will slide apart and the sarcomere will lengthen. Now there's another component here, and this was not, when I learned this in school 20 years ago, they did not have this. They did not know about this. So what do you think? I mentioned it previously. What characteristic of muscle tissue could be explained by having a spring? Elasticity, right? So we also have elastic filaments, right? And these are called titin. So we have actin, myosin, and titin. So that is in yellow. So if I were to stretch this out, the fibers would slide away from each other, right? But then it would want to come back to a resting position because of this. So this just means if I straighten out the spring, that energy is going to be stored and there's going to be recoil, right? And that is what keeps the muscle from staying extended too much. Okay. So if we look at the arrangement here of the sarcomeres, there's actually a picture here. This is actually an electron micrograph picture of the inside. And so you can actually see the thin filaments here and the thick filaments there. And then if we look at the difference here, this would be when a muscle is not contracting. So it is relaxed. So notice that, that there is some overlap between the thin and the thick muscles, right? And this is when it is contracted. So the thin and the thick muscles would push, and actually it pushes, doesn't it? It extends. And I never paid much attention to what was happening with the elastic fibers. I'll put a big line description of them. Because when they're relaxed, they actually are more sprung out. So it's actually the opposite. So it would be like taking a spring and pushing it down, and then it pops back open, right? Ooh, that's a different idea. Okay, but notice that my sarcomere has shortened here, and there's more overlap between the actin and the myosin filaments. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about this sliding filament and contraction of a muscle fiber. So the first thing that we have to have is a motor neuron releases ACH into the synapse. Right. ACH binds directly to the these sodium ion channels. Because remember that acetylcholine is direct acting. Okay. So the skeletal muscle becomes depolarized. Right? So it moves from a more negative state to a more positive state because the sodium ions flood into the inside of the cell. So depolarization, when we talked about the neurons, was going from a negative 70 to a positive 30 was depolarization. So it's similar in the skeletal muscles. This depolarization causes calcium to be released. So this is inside the muscle fiber. Where is calcium stored? Remember, it's in an organelle called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So in your book, there's a bunch of really nice figures that have this described, right? So I could put this on the test, the exam. So notice that that is a motor neuron. It is myelinated, it's heavily myelinated. Most somatic motor neurons are. And then notice that we have the junction. So we saw this in our, when we were looking at this underneath the microscope in lab, we saw these bulbs, right? And the bulbs are just the ends of the terminals. So here, the acetylcholine is released, and notice that it binds right to the sodium ion channels, right? And it causes a depolarization, a wave of electrical energy to move through the skeletal muscle cell. And then that depolarization goes into the inside, and you don't need to know anything about T-tubules either, or the cistern. But this right here is my sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is what is storing the calcium ions. And then here, this is showing calcium ions being released into the myofibril. It's going to go into the myofibril, and it's going to interact with the actin and the myosin, okay, to allow them to bind to one another and for sliding of the filaments to occur. 4 or 5. Calcium, the presence of calcium, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, but the presence of calcium allows the myosin heads to form what they call cross bridges with the actin. So the myosin, which is the thick filament, has a head on it. So I'm just going to draw here my myosin filament. And it has these things that extend up like this. And then this would be my actin filament. So these right here are the myosin heads. So this is myosin. This is actin. And these are my myosin heads. Right? So they have binding sites. The myosin binding sites are on the actin. And if calcium is present, those are exposed, and the myosin could bind there, and then they're going to ratchet. So they're actually going to bind, and then they're going to, they actually cock the head becomes a little bit cocked, they call it. And then it goes up, and it binds to the actin, and then its energy is released, and the filaments will slide. So it's quite an amazing feat that, you know, we can figure out how this works. It's just like a little mechanical thing that's going on inside your cells every time the muscle cells contract, right? And it's occurring a lot, right? So one muscle cell can have millions of these actin and myosin that are causing this contraction to occur. So it's the movement of the myosin heads that causes the filaments to slide. So if we look at a diagram that shows this part, this is my myosin. It's got those myosin heads that are going to be able to bind to the actin. And this is my actin. So when we talk about regulatory proteins, we also have these in our so regulatory proteins, so this would be not listed, not a numerical. Okay, so we're just going to talk about these, and these include tropomyosin. And these are associated with actin filaments. so tropo means upon, and so these are proteins that sit on the myosin binding sites. So these are proteins that cover myosin binding sites. There's another protein called troponin. Troponin actually is the regular protein that binds calcium. And by binding calcium, it changes shape. So proteins are known to be have a specific three-dimensional shape. They're called globular proteins. They have this really fancy shape that is important. So when calcium binds, it changes the shape and it causes tropomyosin to move. So tropomyosin moves. Right? And so what this is this is the mechanism by which calcium allows the myosin heads to bind. So myosin heads can bind. Okay. So let's look at this diagram in your book. So this is the thin filaments, the actin. That orange snake-like structure, that's the long tropomyosin. Those little holes are the binding sites. And so you notice that this is where calcium is not present and those binding sites are covered. This is called troponin, and it binds calcium and it causes that tropomyosin to change shape so that the myosin head can bind. And so this is another diagram. I should have made this one bigger too. This is the calcium. Notice calcium is binding to the little yellow structure there, and it creates the movement, and it allows for the myosin head to bind, and then ultimately to pivot and to cause the filaments to slide. Okay. So the last component of this is ATP. So remember that this is the energy. And this powers the myosin cross bridges. So it is chemical energy, and it is being converted into mechanical energy. So chemical energy is converted into mechanical energy. And just by physical property, it's a law of thermodynamics, is that when you convert from one form of energy into another, it is inefficient. So what do we produce when this happens as a byproduct? So when you're running, what happens to your body? Heat, yeah, so this is heat. So heat is actually a byproduct of going from chemical energy to mechanical energy. And that's why we can shiver and our muscles will contract and they'll actually produce heat. That's the mechanism. Okay. So if we were to look at this, the ATP binds it and energizes the head. So ATP binds to the myosin head. And, excuse me, I might sneeze here. Oh, geez. And binds the myosin head and energizes it. So to energize it, ATP is actually broken down into adenosine diphosphate plus phosphate. So we remove one of the phosphates essentially. So triphosphate goes to diphosphate. And then we have energy, right? So that myosin head holds that energy, and then it binds to the actin, and then when the energy is released, it causes the filaments to slide. Okay, so it cocks, it pivots, and the filaments slide together, and the sarcomere shortens. Okay. So this is the diagram that shows this process. So ATP is binds, right? So we go right here. So when it is broken down into ADP and P, that energy causes the head to cock, right? And then it binds, and then it pivots, and then the filaments slide together. The interesting thing about this is that ATP is also necessary for the release of the myosin heads from the actin. And so if ATP runs out, say for example you die, right, and you have no more ATP, then your muscles are going to stay contracted, and that is what's going to cause rigor mortis, right? So for the myosin heads to unbind, ATP must attach. Okay. So if it doesn't, it leads to contraction after death, which is called rigor mortis, which lasts a period of time, could be hours, depending upon decomposition. So it will get stiff after death, and then it'll get soft again when the bacteria and then the cells start to break down and it starts to decompose. The other reason why rigor mortis also happens is that, I'll just put this in parentheses, is that ATP, ATP is also needed to remove calcium and store it in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So if you have calcium remaining inside the cell, that is also going to lead to a sustained contraction. So calcium levels are really important outside of the cell and inside of the cell. And so being hypo or hyperkalemic, which means that your calcium levels are off, can have effects on your muscles, but also on your nervous system. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the endocrine system, which produces hormones that regulate calcium ion concentration.
Does potassium have anything?
Yes, so potassium is important for the nervous system, but it because it must also affect the muscles, because when you get cramping, that could be due to low potassium. We'll talk about that too, I think, when we get to the endocrine system.
Well, it seems more common recently to have potassium overdoses because of calcium. Because your calcium and potassium levels aren't the same. I just was like, does the potassium store in the muscles too? Or is that more of just
It's a nervous system thing, and it probably is in the muscle because that causes, remember the sodium potassium is what causes the change in membrane potential. So I think the muscles are probably pretty much like the nervous tissue in that they regulate those concentrations really carefully in order to make it so that the cell can become excitable and also relax. So remember, it's the potassium, excuse me. So if you think about the neuron, it's the potassium that actually moves back in to cause repolarization. And so maybe that's similar to this, is that to repolarize the skeletal muscle, you need the potassium to come back in. Yeah. Okay, so we're just going to watch a little movie that talks about muscles and talks about some of this, and then leads into some of the other things that we are going to be talking about. And so we're going to talk about what makes muscles grow.
Muscles. We have over 600 of them. They make up between 1/3 and 1/2 of our body weight. And along with connective tissue, they bind us together, hold us up, and help us move. And whether or not bodybuilding is your hobby, muscles need your constant attention because the way you treat them on a daily basis determines whether they will wither or grow. Say you're standing in front of a door, ready to pull it open. Your brain and muscles are perfectly poised to pull. First, your brain sends a signal to motor neurons inside your arm. When they receive this message, they fire, causing muscles to contract and relax, which pull on the bones in your arm and generate the needed movement. The bigger the challenge becomes, the bigger the brain's signal grows, and the more motor units it rallies to help you achieve your task. But what if the door is made of solid iron? At this point, your arm muscles alone won't be able to generate enough tension to pull it open. So your brain appeals to other muscles for help. You plant your feet, tighten your belly, and tense your back, generating enough force to yank it open. Your nervous system has just leveraged the resources you already have, other muscles, to meet the demand. While all this is happening, your muscle fibers undergo another kind of cellular change. As you expose them to stress, they experience microscopic damage, which in this context is a good thing. In response, the injured cells release inflammatory molecules called cytokines that activate the immune system to repair the injury. This is when the muscle building magic happens. The greater the damage to the muscle tissue, the more your body will need to repair itself. The resulting cycle of damage and repair eventually makes muscles bigger and stronger as they adapt to progressively greater demands. Since our bodies have already adapted to most everyday activities, those generally don't produce enough stress to stimulate new muscle growth. So to build new muscle, a process called hypertrophy, our cells need to be exposed to higher workloads than they are used to. In fact, if you don't continuously expose your muscles to some resistance, they will shrink, a process known as muscular atrophy. In contrast, exposing the muscle to a high degree of tension, especially while the muscle is lengthening, also called an eccentric contraction, generates effective conditions for new growth. However, muscles rely on more than just activity to grow. Without proper nutrition, hormones, and rest, your body would never be able to repair damaged muscle fibers. Protein in our diet preserves muscle mass by providing the building blocks for new tissue in the form of amino acids. Adequate protein intake, along with naturally occurring hormones like insulin-like growth factor and testosterone, help shift the body into a state where tissue is repaired and grown. This vital repair process mainly occurs when we're resting, especially at night while sleeping. Gender and age affect this repair mechanism, which is why young men with more testosterone have a leg up in the muscle building game. Genetic factors also play a role in one's ability to grow muscle. Some people have more robust immune reactions to muscle damage and are better able to repair and replace damaged muscle fibers, increasing their muscle building potential. The body responds to the demands you place on it. If you tear your muscles up, eat right, rest, and repeat, you'll create the conditions to make your muscles as big and strong as possible. It is with muscles as it is with life. Meaningful growth requires challenge and stress.
Okay, so what is it called when your muscles shrink? Atrophy. So you probably have heard of atrophy, like in terms of people that are on bed rest, And also people that go up into outer space, right? They're not exposed to the stresses of gravity, and so their muscles will tend to shrink. So atrophy refers to muscle shrinking. And one way they do this is that there is a decrease in the diameter of the muscle fiber. And one of the interesting things is that as you age, your muscles will just generally atrophy, probably due to hormones. So as you get older, you lose muscle mass. And so muscles actually take quite a bit of energy to maintain. And so one idea about losing weight as you get older is that if you build up more muscles, then you're going to be able to eat more food and then burn off those increased in calories. So if you don't have a lot of muscle mass because you don't do a lot of weight-bearing exercises, then you're not going to be, or you're going to need a lot fewer calories than if you have a greater muscle mass. So hypertrophy is muscles increasing. And this could be in the diameter of the muscle fiber. And it could also be due to an increase in the number of muscle fibers. So one thought about those microscopic tears that occur when you exercise is that the tearing of the muscle actually creates new muscle fibers. So tearing may play a role in this. So tearing, repairing may play a role. And that's kind of controversial about the tearing, if you can tear it and actually go from having one muscle fiber to two muscle fibers due to tearing of the muscle. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today, and then we'll continue on our discussion about muscles. So that was the big microscopic anatomy. So we're going to start talking more about just the muscles as organs and what they do.
I might go to nap.